Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker GCSI CBPRS was one of the greatest British botanists and explorers of the 19th century. He was a founder of geographical botany and Charles Darwin's closest friend. For 20 years he served as director of the Royal Botanical Gardens, Kew, succeeding his father, William Jackson Hooker, and was awarded the highest honours of British science. Biography. Early years. Hooker was born in Halesworth, Suffolk, England. He was the second son of the famous botanist Sir William Jackson Hooker, Regius Professor of Botany, and Maria Sarah Turner, eldest daughter of the banker Dawson Turner and sister-in-law of Francis Palgrave. From age 7, Hooker attended his father's lectures at Glasgow University, taking an early interest in plant distribution and the voyages of explorers like Captain James Cook. He was educated at the Glasgow High School and went on to study medicine at Glasgow University, graduating M.D. in 1839. This degree qualified him for employment in the Naval Medical Service. He joined the renowned polar explorer Captain James Clark Ross's Antarctic expedition to the South Magnetic Pole after receiving a commission as assistant surgeon on HMS Erebus. Marriages and children. In 1851 he married Frances Harriet Henslow, daughter of Darwin's mentor, John Stevens Henslow. They had 4 sons and 3 daughters. William Henslow Hooker. Harriet Ann Hooker married William Turner of Thistleton Dyer. Charles Paget Hooker. Maria Elizabeth Hooker died aged 6. Brian Harvey Hodgson Hooker. Reginald Hawthorne Hooker, statistician. Grace Ellen Hooker. Frances Harriet Henslow's contribution to his work included translating French botanical texts which Hooker edited. After his first wife's death in 1874, in 1876 he married Hyacinth Jardine, daughter of William Samuel Symonds and the widow of Sir William Jardine. They had 2 sons, Joseph Symonds Hooker, Richard Symonds Hooker. Death and burial. Joseph Hooker died in his sleep at midnight at home on 10 December 1911 after a short and apparently minor illness. The Dean and Chapter of Westminster Abbey offered a grave near Darwin's in the nave but also insisted that Hooker be cremated before. His widow, Hyacinth, declined the proposal and eventually Hooker's body was buried, as he wished to be, alongside his father in the churchyard of St Anne's Church, Kew, on Kew Green, within short distance of Kew Gardens. His memorial tablet in the church with the motif of 5 plants was designed by Matilde Smith. Work. Voyage to the Antarctic 1839 to 1843. Hooker's first expedition, led by James Clark Ross, consisted of 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. It was the last major voyage of exploration made entirely under sail. Hooker was the youngest of the 128-man crew. He sailed on the Erebus and was assistant to Robert McCormick, who in addition to being the ship's surgeon was instructed to collect zoological and geological specimens. The ships sailed on 30 September 1839. Before journeying to Antarctica they visited Madeira, Tenerife, Santiago and Quail Island in the Cape Verde archipelago, St. Paul Rocks, Trinidad, east of Brazil, St. Helena, and the Cape of Good Hope. Hooker made plant collections at each location and while traveling through these and specimens of algae and sea life pulled aboard using tow nets. For the Cape they entered the Southern Ocean. The first stop was the Crozet Islands, where they sat down on Possession Island to deliver coffee to sealers. They departed for the Kerguelen Islands, where they would spend several days. Hooker identified 18 flowering plants, 35 mosses and liverworts, 25 lichens and 51 algae, including some that were not described by Surgeon William Anderson when James Cook had visited the islands in 1772. The expedition spent some time in Hobart, the Van Diemen's Land, and then moved on to the Auckland Islands and Campbell Island, and onward to Antarctica to locate the South Magnetic Pole. After spending 5 months in the Antarctic, they returned to resupply in Hobart, then went on to Sydney, and the Bay of Islands in New Zealand. They left New Zealand to return to Antarctica. After spending 138 days at sea, and a collision between the Erebus and Terror, they sailed to the Falkland Islands, to Tierra del Fuego, back to the Falklands and onward to the third sortie into the Antarctic. They made a landing at Cockburn Island and after leaving the Antarctic, stopped at the Cape St. Helena and Ascension Island. The ships arrived back in England on the 4th of September 1843. The voyage had been a success for Ross as it was the first to confirm the existence of the southern continent and chart much of its coastline. Geological Survey of Great Britain. In 1845, Hooker applied for the chair of botany at the University of Edinburgh. This position included duties at the Royal Botanical Gardens of Scotland, and so the appointment was influenced by local politicians. An unusually protracted struggle ensued, resulting in the election of the locally born and bred botanist John Hutton Balfour. The Darwin correspondence, now public, makes clear Darwin's sense of shock at this unexpected outcome. Hooker declined a chair at Glasgow University which became vacant on Balfour's appointment. Instead, he took a position as botanist to the Geological Survey of Great Britain in 1846. He began work on paleobotany, searching for fossil plants in the coal beds of Wales, eventually discovering the first coal ball in 1855. He became engaged to Frances Henslow, daughter of Charles Darwin's botany tutor John Stevens Henslow, but he was keen to continue to travel and gain more experience in the field. He wanted to travel to India and the Himalayas. In 1847 his father nominated him to travel to India and collect plants for Q. Voyage to the Himalayas and India 1847 to 1851. On the 11th of November 1847 Hooker left England for his 3-year-long Himalayan expedition. He would be the first European to collect plants in the Himalaya. He received free passage on HMS Sidon to the Nile and then travelled overland to Suez where he boarded a ship to India. He arrived in Calcutta on the 12th of January 1848, then travelled by elephant to Mirzapur, up the Ganges by boat to Siliguri and overland by pony to Darjeeling, arriving on the 16th of April 1848. Hooker's expedition was based in Darjeeling where he stayed with naturalist Brian Houghton Hodgson. Through Hodgson he met British East India Company representative Archibald Campbell who negotiated Hooker's admission to Sikkim, which was finally approved in 1849. Meanwhile, Hooker wrote to Darwin relaying to him the habits of animals in India, and collected plants in Bengal. He explored with local resident Charles Barnes, then travelled along the Great Ranjit River to its junction with the Titha River and Tonglu Mountain in the Singila Range on the border with Nepal. Hooker and a sizable party of local assistants departed for eastern Nepal on the 27th of October 1848. They travelled to Zongri, west over the spurs of Kangchenjunga, and northwest along Nepal's passes into Tibet. In April 1849 he planned a longer expedition into Sikkim. Leaving on the 3rd of May, he travelled northwest up the Lakan Valley to the Kongra Lama Pass and then to the Lakum Pass. Campbell and Hooker were imprisoned by the Diwan of Sikkim as they travelled towards the Chola in Tibet. A British team was sent to negotiate with the King of Sikkim. However, they were released without any bloodshed, and Hooker returned to Darjeeling, where he spent January and February 1850 writing his journals, replacing specimens lost during his detention, and planning a journey for his last year in India. According to an 1887 journal written by Indian administrator Richard Temple, many of the rhododendrons found in English gardens of the time were grown from seeds collected by Hooker in Sikkim. Reluctant to return to Sikkim, and unenthusiastic about traveling in Bhutan, he chose to make his last Himalayan expedition to Sylhet and the Khasi Hills in Assam. He was accompanied by Thomas Thomson, a fellow student from Glasgow University. They left Darjeeling on the 1st of May 1850, then sailed to the Bay of Bengal and travelled overland by elephant to the Khasi Hills and established a headquarters for the studies in Chara, where they stayed until the 9th of December, when they began the trip back to England. Hooker's survey of hitherto unexplored regions, the Himalayan Journals, dedicated to Charles Darwin, was published by the Calcutta Trigonometrical Survey Office in 1854, abbreviated again in 1855 and later by the Minerva Library of Famous Books published by Ward, Lock, Bowden and Amp Co. in 1891. When Hooker returned to England, his father had been appointed director of the Royal Botanical Gardens, Kew, and so was now a prominent man of science. William Hooker, through his connections, secured an Admiralty grant of £1,000 to defray the cost of plates for his son's Botany of the Antarctic voyages, and an annual stipend of £200 for Joseph while he worked on the Flora. Hooker's Flora was also to include that collected on the voyages of Cook and Menzies held by the British Museum and collections made on the Beagle. The Floras were illustrated by Walter Hood Fitch, who would go on to become the most prolific Victorian botanical artist. Hooker's collections from the Antarctic voyage were described eventually in one of 2 volumes published as the Flora Antarctica. In the Flora he read about islands and the role in plant geography. The work made Hooker's reputation as a systemist and plant geographer. His works on the voyage were completed with Flora Novae Zelandii and Flora Tasmaniae. This trip was taken in the autumn of 1860, with Daniel Hanbury. They visited and collected in Syria and Palestine. No full-length report was published, but a number of papers were written. Hooker recognized 3 phytogeographical divisions: Western Syria and Palestine, Eastern Syria and Palestine, Middle and Upper Mountain regions of Syria. Hooker visited Morocco from April to June 1871, in the company of John Ball, George Moore and a young gardener from Kew, called Crumb. This was undertaken with his friend Asher Gray, the leading American botanist of the day. They wished to investigate the connection between the floras of eastern United States and those of eastern continental Asia and Japan, and the line of demarcation between Arctic floras of America and Greenland. As probable causes they considered the glacial periods and an earlier land connection with an Arctic continent. A difficult question was why in the great mountain chains of the western United States there appeared to be only a few botanical enclaves of plants of Eastern Asiatic affinities among plants of Mexican and more southern types. Hooker visited a number of cities and botanical institutions before moving west and climbing to 9,000 feet to Camp at La Veta. From Fort Garland they climbed the Sierra Blanca at 14,500 feet. After returning to La Veta, they went beyond Colorado Springs to Pikes Peak, next to Denver and Salt Lake City for an excursion into the Wasatch Mountains. A journey of 29 hours took them to Reno and Carson City, then Silver City, and 10 days by wagon across the Sierra Nevada. Thus they came to the Yosemite and Calaveras Grove, and ended up in San Francisco. Hooker was back in Kew with 1,000 dried specimens by October. His comments on his encounters include the following: after meeting and talking to Brigham Young, whom he described as respectable and well-spoken, all the school children are brought up to believe in him, and in a lot of scripture history as useless and idle as that taught in our schools. Of Georgetown, the fingertip of civilization, where the people sleep without locks to the doors, the fire engines are well manned and in capital order, and there is no end of food. The New Englanders are most like us in language, speech and habits. The Americans are great and promiscuous eaters. Beds are remarkably clean and good, but the pillows are too soft. His views on the flora of Colorado and Utah: there are two temperate and two colder mountain floras, viz. 1. A prairie flora derived from the eastward, 2. A sea-cold desert and saline flora derived from the west, 3. A subalpine, 4. An alpine flora, the two latter of widely different origin, and in one sense proper to the Rocky Mountain ranges. His overview of North American flora contained these elements: the polar area, from the Bering Strait to Greenland; British North American flora, south of the Arctic flora, in 5 meridional belts; United States flora, in belts; the Great Eastern Forest region, for the Atlantic to beyond the Mississippi; the Prairie region; the Sink region, confined to gullies of the mountains; the Sierra Nevada; Darwin and evolution while on the Erebus. Hooker had read proofs of Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle provided by Charles Lyell and had been very impressed by Darwin's skill as a naturalist. They had met once, before the Antarctic voyage embarked. After Hooker's return to England, he was approached by Darwin, who invited him to classify the plants that Darwin had collected in South America and the Galapagos Islands. Hooker agreed, and the pair began a lifelong friendship. On the 11th of January 1844, Darwin mentioned to Hooker his early ideas on the transmutation of species and natural selection, and Hooker showed interest. In 1847 he agreed to read Darwin's essay explaining the theory, and responded with notes giving Darwin calm critical feedback. Their correspondence continued throughout the development of Darwin's theory, and in 1858 Darwin wrote that Hooker was the one living soul from whom I have constantly received sympathy. Richard Freeman wrote, Hooker was Charles Darwin's greatest friend and confidant. Certainly they had extensive correspondence, and they also met face-to-face. Hooker and Lyell were the two people Darwin consulted when Wallace's famous letter arrived at Down House, enclosing his paper on natural selection. Hooker was instrumental in creating the device whereby the Wallace paper was accompanied by Darwin's notes and his letter to Asher Gray in a presentation to the Linnean Society. Hooker was the one who formally presented this material to the Linnean Society meeting in 1858. In 1859, the author of The Origin of Species recorded his indebtedness to Hooker's wide knowledge and balanced judgment. In December 1859, Hooker published the introductory essay to the Flora Tasmaniae, the final part of the Botany of the Antarctic voyage. It was in this essay that Hooker announced his support for the theory of evolution by natural selection, thus becoming the first recognized man of science to publicly back Darwin. At the historic debate on evolution held at the Oxford University Museum on 30 June 1860, Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, Benjamin Brodie and Robert Fitzroy spoke against Darwin's theory, and Hooker and Thomas Henry Huxley defended it. According to Hooker's own account, it was he and not Huxley who delivered the most effective reply to Wilberforce's arguments. Hooker acted as president of the British Association at its its Norwich meeting of 1868, when his address was remarkable for its championship of Darwinian theories. He was a close friend of Thomas Henry Huxley, a member of the X Club, and the first of the three X-Clubbers in succession to become president of the Royal Society. In 1862, he was elected a foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, Royal Botanic Gardens. By his travels and his publications, Hooker built up a high scientific reputation at home. In 1855 he was appointed Assistant Director of the Royal Botanic Gardens, and in 1865 he succeeded his father as full director, holding the post for 20 years. Under the directorship of father and son Hooker, the Royal Botanic Gardens of Kew rose to world renown. At the age of 30, Hooker was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, and in 1873 he was chosen its president. He received 3 of its medals: the Royal Medal in 1854, the Copley in 1887 and the Darwin Medal in 1892. He continued to intersperse work at Kew with foreign exploration and collecting. His journeys to Palestine, Morocco and the United States all produced valuable information and specimens for Kew. He started the series Flora Indica in 1855 together with Thomas Thomson. The botanical observations and the publication of the rhododendrons of Sikkim Himalaya formed the basis of elaborate works on the rhododendrons of the Sikkim Himalaya and on the flora of India. His works were illustrated with lithographs by Walter Hood Fitch. His greatest botanical work was the Flora of British India, published in 7 volumes starting in 1872. On the publication of the last part in 1897, he was promoted Knight Grand Commander of the Order of the Star of India. 10 years later, on attaining the age of 90 in 1907, he was awarded the Order of Merit. He was the author of numerous scientific papers and monographs, and his larger books included, in addition to those already mentioned, a standard student's Flora of the British Isles and a monumental work, the Genera Plantarum, based on the collections at Kew, in which he had the assistance of George Bentham. His collaboration with George Bentham was especially important. Bentham, an amateur botanist who worked at Kew for many years, was perhaps the leading botanical systematist of the 19th century. The Handbook of the British Flora, begun by Bentham and completed by Hooker, was the standard text for 100 years. It was always known as Bentham and Amp Hooker. In 1904, at the age of 87, Hooker published a sketch of the vegetation of the Indian Empire. He continued the compilation of his father Sir William Jackson Hooker's project, Icons Plantarum, producing volumes 11 through 19, with most of the illustrations being prepared for him by Matilda Smith. Attacks on Hooker and on Kew. The herbarium at Kew was founded in 1853, and quickly grew in size and importance. At the time, Richard Owen was the superintendent of the natural history departments of the British Museum, reporting only to the head of the British Museum. Hooker, appointed in 1855 as assistant director of Kew, was the man most responsible for bringing foreign specimens to Kew. There is no doubt that rivalry resulted between the British Museum, where there was the very important herbarium of the Department of Botany, and Kew. The rivalry at times became extremely personal, especially between Joseph Hooker and Owen. At the root was Owen's feeling that Kew should be subordinate to the British Museum and should not be allowed to develop as an independent, scientific institution with the advantage of a great botanic garden. The relationship between the two men continued to deteriorate after Hooker became a supporter of Darwin's views and a member of the X Club, who set out to get away with the Royal Society. In 1868 Hooker had proposed that the whole whole of the huge herbarium collection of Joseph Banks should be moved from the British Museum to Kew. A reasonable idea, but a threat to Owen's plans for a museum in South Kensington to house the natural history collections. Hooker cited mismanagement at the British Museum as a justification. After Joseph had succeeded his father as director in 1865, the independence of Kew was seriously threatened by the machinations of a Member of Parliament, Acton Smeaton, whose appointment as first Commissioner of Works by Gladstone in 1869 was greeted in the Times with the prophecy that it would prove another instance of Mr. Ayrton's unfortunate tendency to carry out what he thinks right in as unpleasant a manner as possible. This was relevant because Kew was funded by the Board of Works, and the director of Kew reported to the first commissioner. The conflict between the two men lasted from 1870 to 1872, and there is a voluminous correspondence on the Ayrton episodes held at Kew. Ayrton behaved in an extraordinary way, interfering and approaching Hooker's colleagues behind his back, apparently with the aim of getting Hooker to resign. When the expenditure on Kew could be curtailed and diverted, Ayrton actually took staff appointments out of Hooker's hands. He seemed not to value the scientific work, and to believe Kew should be just an amusement park. My life has become utterly detestable and I'd long to throw up the directorship. What can be more humiliating than 2 years of wrangling with such a creature? Finally, Hooker asked to be put in communication with Gladstone's private secretary, Algernon West. A full statement was drawn up over the signatures of Darwin, Isle, Huxley, Tyndall, Bentham and others. It was laid before Parliament by John Lubbock, and additional papers laid before the House of Lords. Lord Derby called for all the correspondence on the matter. The Treasury supported Hooker and criticized Ayrton's behavior. One extraordinary fact emerged. There had been an official report on Kew which had not previously been seen in public. Ayrton had caused this to be written by Richard Owen. Hooker had not seen it, and so he had not been given right of reply. However, the report was amongst the papers laid before Parliament, and it contained the most unscrupulous attack on both the Hookers, and suggested that they had mismanaged the care of the trees, and that the systematic botany was nothing more than attaching barbarous binomials to foreign weeds. The discovery of this report no doubt helped to sway opinion in favor of Hooker and Kew. Hooker replied to the Owen report point by point in a factual manner, and his reply placed with the other papers on the case. When Ayrton was questioned about it in the debate led by Lubbock, he replied that Hooker was too low an official to raise questions of matter with a minister of the Crown. The outcome was not a vote in the Commons, but a kind of truce until, in August 1874, Gladstone transferred Ayrton from the Board of Works to the office of Judge Advocate General just before his government fell. Ayrton failed to get re-elected to Parliament. For the moment the value of the Botanic Gardens has never been seriously questioned. In the midst of his troubles, Hooker was elected as President of the Royal Society in 1873. This showed publicly the high regard which Hooker's fellow scientists had for him, and the great importance they attached to his work. Honours: 1847 Fellow of the Royal Society, 1869 Companion of the Order of the Bath, 1877 Knight Commander of the Order of the Star of India, 1873 President of the Royal Society, 1883 Founders Gold Medal of the Royal Geographical Society, 1885 Foreign Member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, 1897 Knight Grand Commander of the Order of the Star of India, Paula Merit from the Kingdom of Prussia, awarded by the German Emperor in June 1902. 1907 Order of Merit. Hooker Oak in Chico, California, was named after him. Taxa named in honor. There are a number of plants with specific name Hookery and Hookeriana. The majority of them are named in honor of Joseph Dalton Hooker, including Banksia hookeriana, Crinodendron hookerianum, Grevillea hookeriana, Iris hookeriana, Iris hookeri, Polygonatum hookeri, Sarcococca hookeriana and Salix hookeriana. Land snail Notodiscus hookeri.